The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as Abigail Keller stepped off the stagecoach, her hands gripping her daughter's small shoulders. The year was 1878, and the Colorado Territory was no place for a woman alone, but Abigail had run out of options when the letter from her late cousin's lawyer had arrived, offering her a small inheritance, a schoolhouse in need of a teacher. "Mama, is this our new home?" 6-year-old Emma looked up with wide eyes, clutching a worn book to her chest, a gift from her father before he had ridden off to war and never returned. "Yes, sweetheart," Abigail replied, surveying the frontier town with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Wooden buildings lined the street, their weathered facades telling stories of harsh winters and unforgiving summers. Men in dusty hats and spurs moved about with purpose, some pausing to glance at the newcomers. The inheritance had seemed like Providence after the boarding house where she'd taught in Boston had burned down, leaving her and Emma with nothing but each other and a handful of possessions. The journey west had consumed most of their savings, but the promise of a new beginning had driven Abigail forward. "Mrs. Keller," a man in a neat suit approached, hat in hand. "I'm Thomas Wilson, the town lawyer. Welcome to Willow Creek." "Thank you for meeting us," Abigail said, shaking his hand firmly. "We're eager to see the schoolhouse." "Of course, but first, there's a matter we should discuss." His expression turned serious. "The building needs significant repairs. The town council has allocated some funds, but we'll need help with the work." As they walked, Thomas explained that a local rancher had volunteered to assist with the reconstruction. "Preston Irwin," he said, "owns the Double I Ranch just outside town. Not the most sociable fellow, but he's reliable and strong as an ox." Abigail nodded, her mind already calculating what needed to be done before the school term could begin. The town wasn't large, perhaps 300 souls at most, but the children deserved an education, and she intended to provide it. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a small, single-room building with a bell tower that had seen better days. The windows were cracked, the porch sagged, and the roof looked as though it might collapse with the next strong wind. "It's quaint," Abigail said diplomatically, noting Emma's fallen expression. "The living quarters are in the back," Thomas explained, unlocking the door. "Basic but serviceable." The interior was dusty but more promising than the exterior. A large blackboard dominated one wall, rows of desks faced it, and bookshelves mostly empty lined another wall. The living area consisted of a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a sitting area. "School begins in 3 weeks," Thomas informed her. "Most families are eager to have their children educated." "I'll be ready," Abigail promised, even as she wondered how she would manage. Later that evening, as Abigail was sweeping years of dust from the floor, a shadow darkened the doorway. She turned to find a tall man filling the frame, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides. "Mrs. Keller?" His voice was deep with a slight rasp to it. "Yes," she answered, straightening her spine. "Preston Irwin." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of a stormy sky. "Heard you might need some help with this place." Abigail took his measure quickly. He was older than her 28 years, perhaps in his mid-30s, with the hard-earned muscle of a man who worked his land rather than hiring others to do it. His clothes were simple but clean denims, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing forearms corded with muscle, and worn boots. "Mr. Wilson mentioned you might be willing to assist," she said carefully. "I would be grateful for any help you can offer." Preston nodded, surveying the room with a critical eye. "Roof needs replacing, walls need reinforcing, windows." He shook his head. "Got my wagon outside with some lumber. Can start tomorrow at first light." "That would be Mama." Emma's small voice came from behind her. "I'm hungry." Preston's gaze shifted to the child, and something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. "This is my daughter, Emma," Abigail said, drawing the girl forward. Emma, this is Mr. Irwin. He's going to help us fix the schoolhouse. Emma regarded Preston solemnly, still clutching her book. Will you make it pretty, like in my story? Preston's brow furrowed as he looked at the book. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I ain't much for pretty, miss, but I can make it solid. Won't leak when it rains or creak when the wind blows. Emma seemed to consider this. That's important too, she decided. The corner of Preston's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Yes, it is. He turned back to Abigail. I'll bring some men from my ranch. We'll get it done before school starts. Thank you, Abigail said sincerely. Would you like to stay for supper? It's simple fare, but the least I can do. Preston hesitated, his eyes moving from Abigail to Emma and back. No, madam. Got stock to tend to. He settled his hat back on his head. First light, he repeated, and then he was gone, boots echoing on the weathered porch. Abigail watched his retreating figure, noting the straight spine and purposeful stride. There was a story there, she thought, in the way he held himself apart, in the way his eyes had clouded when he'd looked at Emma's book. I like him, Mama, Emma said unexpectedly. He's like the mountain in my story, big and strong and watching over everything. Abigail smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. Let's get our supper and then make our bed, shall we? Tomorrow will be a busy day. True to his word, Preston arrived at dawn, his wagon laden with lumber and tools, 3 ranch hands in tow. Abigail had risen early, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast of biscuits and bacon. Wasn't expecting food, Preston said gruffly when she invited the men to eat before beginning work. A man works better on a full stomach, she replied, pouring coffee into tin cups. Besides, I was a teacher in Boston for 6 years. I know the value of starting the day properly. Preston's men, Jim, a weathered man in his 50s, Hank, a jovial fellow with a booming laugh, and Miguel, a quiet young man with quick hands, ate heartily, complimenting her cooking. Preston ate too, though more reservedly, his eyes occasionally straying to the small bookshelf where Abigail had placed the few volumes she'd brought with her. The men worked efficiently, tearing off the damaged roof and beginning to rebuild it, while Preston himself reinforced the walls and repaired the sagging porch. Abigail kept them supplied with water and food, splitting her time between caring for the workers, arranging her meager supplies in the living quarters, and planning lessons for the coming term. Emma flitted between helping her mother and watching the men work, her book never far from her hands. Around midday, Abigail found her sitting near Preston, who was planing a board for a window frame. Mr. Irwin, would you like to see my book? Emma asked suddenly. It has beautiful pictures. Preston's hands stilled on the plane. He didn't look at the child. Best not disturb me while I'm working, little miss. Oh, Emma's face fell. I just thought, Emma, Abigail called, sensing tension. Come help me sort these supplies, please. As Emma reluctantly moved away, Abigail caught a glimpse of something like shame crossing Preston's face. He attacked the wood with renewed vigor, his movements almost angry. The pattern continued for days. Preston and his men would arrive at dawn, work until dusk, and then depart, Preston always declining Abigail's invitations to stay for supper. She learned bits about him from his men, that he'd built his ranch from nothing after returning from the war, that he was fair but demanding, that he kept to himself, except for occasional trips into town for supplies or to the saloon for a rare drink. What they didn't say, but what Abigail suspected, was that Preston Irwin was a lonely man. She recognized it because she had known that same loneliness after her husband's death, the careful distance one kept from others, the way one filled days with work to avoid thinking about empty evenings. A week into the repairs, a summer storm rolled in suddenly, sending the men scrambling to cover the exposed portions of the roof with tarpaulins. Rain lashed down, turning the dusty ground to mud within minutes. Thunder crashed overhead and lightning split the sky. You men head back to the ranch, Preston shouted over the downpour. I'll secure things here and follow. His ranch hands didn't argue, mounting their horses and galloping away through the deluge. Preston worked quickly to tie down the coverings, but by the time he finished, the storm had intensified to a fury that made travel dangerous. Abigail appeared at the door, holding a lantern. "Mr. Irwin, you can't ride in this. Please come inside until it passes." Preston stood dripping on the porch, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. Another crack of lightning decided him, and he nodded curtly, stomping his boots before entering. "You can hang your coat by the stove to dry," Abigail said, leading him to the living area. The room was warm and lit with several lamps, giving it a cozy feeling despite its sparseness. Emma sat at the small table, still engrossed in her book. "Thank you, Mrs. Keller," Preston said formally, removing his sodden jacket and hat. "Abigail, please," she corrected him. "If you're going to rebuild my home, we should dispense with formalities." A hint of color touched his cheeks. "Preston, then," he conceded, "are you hungry? I was just about to serve supper." "I wouldn't want to impose, it's no imposition, there's plenty of stew." As they ate, Emma chattered about the progress of the schoolhouse, asking Preston dozens of questions about how things were built and why he chose certain materials. To Abigail's surprise, he answered patiently, explaining in simple terms the properties of different woods and the importance of proper joinery. "And will you build new bookshelves?" Emma asked hopefully. "For all the books Mama says will come once school starts." "Already planned on it," Preston replied. "Good, solid oak. Books are heavy things." "Do you like books, Mr. Preston?" Emma continued, pushing her empty bowl aside and pulling her treasured volume closer. Preston's expression shuddered. "Never had much time for them," he said shortly. Emma's eyes widened. "But books are wonderful. They take you to magical places and teach you all sorts of things." She pushed her book toward him. "This one's about a princess who saves herself from a dragon. Would you like to read it?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Preston stared at the book as though it might bite him, his knuckles white where they gripped his spoon. "Emma," Abigail began, sensing his discomfort, but Preston cut her off. "I can't," he said bluntly, his voice rough. He looked up, meeting Abigail's eyes with a mixture of defiance and something that might have been shame. "I can't read." The admission hung in the air. Emma looked confused, but Abigail felt a rush of understanding. His awkwardness around the books, the way he'd avoided Emma's questions about her story, it all made sense now. "Not a word," Preston continued, as though compelled to explain. "Never learned. My pa needed hands on the farm, not heads in books. Then the war came, and after." He shrugged. "Never seemed important. But how do you run your ranch?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. "Got a good head for numbers," he said. "Can cipher well enough. For contracts and such, I got Jim. He reads them to me, makes sure no one's trying to cheat me." His jaw tightened. "Never held me back none." "I didn't mean to suggest it had," Abigail said gently. "Many successful men can't read, but I'm missing out," Preston finished for her with a wry twist of his lips. "That's what you're thinking, ain't it, schoolteacher?" Before Abigail could respond, Emma spoke up. "I could teach you," she offered earnestly. "Mama taught me when I was 4. It's not hard once you know the letters." Preston looked at the little girl, startled. "That's kind, miss, but I mean it." Emma insisted, sliding off her chair and coming around to his side of the table with her book. "Look, this is O for Once Upon a Time. It's round like the moon." Almost involuntarily, Preston's finger reached out to touch the illuminated letter at the beginning of the story. Something in his face softened as Emma continued pointing out letters, explaining their sounds with the simple logic of a child. Abigail watched them, a curious warmth spreading through her chest. There was something profoundly moving about seeing this large, capable man bending his head close to her daughter's, his calloused finger following Emma's smaller one across the page. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, something had shifted. A connection had formed, tentative but real, binding the three of them together in an unexpected moment of vulnerability and trust. When Emma's eyes began to droop, Abigail sent her to prepare for bed. Left alone with Preston, she found herself unsure what to say. She's a good teacher, Preston broke the silence, nodding toward the bedroom where Emma had gone. Patient, like her father, Abigail said softly. He was a schoolteacher too before the war. Preston's eyes met hers. He didn't come back, Abigail shook her head. Gettysburg. Understanding passed between them the shared knowledge of loss, of rebuilding a life from broken pieces. The storm's passing, Preston observed, rising from his chair. I should go. Of course, Abigail said, standing as well. At the door, as he donned his still damp coat and hat, she found herself saying, "The offer stands, you know, to learn. I could teach you if you wanted." Preston paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Why would you do that?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Because everyone deserves the chance to read their own story," she answered simply. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply, before disappearing into the rainy night. Abigail wasn't sure he would take her up on the offer. The next day, work continued as usual, with no mention of the previous evening's revelations. Preston was as taciturn as ever, directing his men and working alongside them with focused intensity. But as the men were packing up their tools at dusk, Preston approached her, hat in hand. "That offer," he said quietly, eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "To learn reading, still stand." Abigail's heart quickened. "Of course. When would be convenient?" The formal word sounded stiff on his lips as though he'd practiced saying it. "Evenings would be best," she replied. "After Emma is in bed, say 8 o'clock, Preston nodded. "Tomorrow, then." He turned to go, then paused. "Don't tell the men," he added, a hint of gruffness returning to his voice. "Don't need them knowing their boss is getting schooled by a slip of a woman." Abigail bit back a smile. "Your secret is safe with me, Mr. Irwin." The next evening, precisely at 8, Preston appeared at her door. He'd clearly made an effort. His hair was damp from washing, his shirt was clean and pressed, and he'd shaved his usual stubble. The effect was striking. Without the shadow on his jaw, his features appeared younger, less forbidding. "Come in," Abigail invited, suddenly aware of her own appearance. She'd changed into her best dress after putting Emma to bed and had let her hair down from its usual practical bun. Catching Preston's surprised glance, she felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "I've prepared some materials," she said, leading him to the table where she'd laid out slate and chalk, along with some simple primers she'd brought from Boston. "We'll start with the alphabet, learning the shapes and sounds of each letter." Preston sat stiffly in the chair, looking at the materials with trepidation. "Seems like a lot to learn." "We'll take it one step at a time," Abigail assured him. "Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is reading." She began by writing the alphabet on the slate, naming each letter and its sound. Preston watched intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When she handed him the chalk to copy the letters, he held it awkwardly, like a man more accustomed to an axe than a writing implement. "Feels foolish," he muttered, his first attempt at a looking more like a lopsided triangle. "Try again," Abigail encouraged, covering his hand with hers to guide the chalk. She felt him stiffen at her touch, then gradually relax as she helped him form the letter. "There, much better." They continued for an hour, working through the first few letters of the alphabet. Preston was a determined student, repeating each letter until he could form it reasonably well, his face set in lines of intense concentration. "That's enough for tonight," Abigail said finally, seeing fatigue in the set of his shoulders. "You've made excellent progress." Preston looked skeptical. "3 letters ain't much." "It's 3 more than you knew yesterday," she pointed out. "Learning to read is like building your schoolhouse one board, one nail at a time." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Suppose you're right about that." He stood, stretching subtly. "Same time tomorrow," Abigail nodded, pleased by his willingness to continue. "I'll be here." Over the next week, a routine developed. Preston and his men would work on the schoolhouse during the day, making rapid progress on the repairs. In the evenings, after the other men had gone and Emma was asleep, Preston would return for his lessons. Abigail found him to be a dedicated student, though not a naturally gifted one. Letters that seemed intuitive to her often confused him, and he struggled to connect sounds to symbols. But what he lacked in natural aptitude, he made up for in sheer determination. He practiced forming letters in the dirt with sticks during breaks, and Abigail sometimes caught him mouthing the alphabet to himself as he worked. As the days passed, she began to see beyond the gruff exterior to the man beneath. There was a gentleness to Preston that surprised her, the way he carefully set aside his work when Emma appeared with a question. The care he took in designing the bookshelves to be accessible to even the smallest students. His insistence that the new blackboard be hung at a height where Abigail wouldn't have to stretch to reach the top. One evening, about 2 weeks into their lessons, Preston arrived looking particularly weary. The day had been brutally hot, and he and his men had been racing to finish the roof before another storm hit. "We don't have to do this tonight," Abigail offered, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes. "You've been working since dawn." "Said I'd come, so I'm here," Preston replied, lowering himself into the chair with barely concealed relief. "Where'd we leave off?" Simple words. Cat, dog, hat. Abigail sat beside him, closer than she might have a week ago. "But truly, you look dead on your feet." Preston's expression softened. "Worried about me, Mrs. Keller, Abigail," she corrected him. "And yes, I am. Even the strongest men need rest." He studied her face for a moment, then sighed. "Been pushing hard to get your schoolhouse done before term starts. Only a week left." "And it's looking wonderful," Abigail assured him. "The transformation is remarkable. Indeed, the building was nearly unrecognizable from the dilapidated structure she'd first seen. The roof was new, the walls reinforced and freshly whitewashed, the windows replaced with clear glass. Inside, the floor had been sanded smooth, the desks repaired, and Preston's bookshelves stood proudly against one wall, waiting to be filled. "Could have been better with more time," Preston said, ever the perfectionist. "It's perfect," Abigail insisted. "Better than any schoolhouse I taught in back east." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sound of Emma's breathing from the bedroom and the distant rumble of thunder announcing an approaching storm. "Why'd you come west?" Preston asked suddenly. "Seems like Boston would offer more for a widow and her child." Abigail considered the question. "After Daniel, my husband, died, I kept teaching at a boarding school for girls. It was a good position, respectable, with room and board for Emma and me, but then there was a fire." She gazed into the middle distance, remembering the flames, the panic, the girls in their night dresses huddled in the street. "No one was hurt, thank God, but I lost everything again. When the letter came about my cousin's property here, it seemed like a sign, I suppose. A chance to build something new, something that was truly mine." "Brave thing to do," Preston observed quietly. "Coming all this way alone." "No braver than building a ranch from nothing," she countered. Preston's mouth quirked. "Least I knew which end of a cow was which." "You ever taught frontier children before?" Abigail laughed, a genuine sound that brightened her face. "I confess I haven't. Are they so different from Boston children, Wilder?" Preston said with certainty. "Used to freedom, won't take kindly to being penned up all day with books." "Then I'll simply have to make the books more interesting than the freedom," Abigail replied confidently. Preston's eyes crinkled at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. "You might at that." The thunder grew louder and rain began to patter against the windows. Preston glanced outside. "Should go before it gets worse." As if in answer, a blinding flash lit up the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered and Emma cried out in her sleep. Abigail rose quickly. "I should check on her. She's frightened of storms." When she returned after calming Emma, she found Preston at the window watching the downpour. "It's coming down in sheets," he said. "Roads will be mud rivers by now." "You can't ride in this," Abigail decided. "You'll have to stay." Preston turned, alarm evident in his expression. "Not proper." "Propriety takes second place to safety," Abigail said firmly. "I won't have you drowning in a flash flood for the sake of appearances." He hesitated, clearly torn. "The sofa is quite comfortable," she added, understanding his concern. and Emma and I will be in the bedroom with the door closed." Finally, Preston nodded. "Until the storm passes," he conceded. Abigail fetched a blanket and pillow, arranging them on the sofa. As she worked, she became intensely aware of Preston's presence behind her, the sound of his breathing, the subtle scent of sawdust and leather that seemed to cling to him. "Thank you," he said when she finished, "for the lessons and the shelter." "You're rebuilding my home," Abigail replied. "It's the least I can do." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how their lives had become unexpectedly intertwined. For a moment, Abigail thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded. "Good night, then," she said softly, retreating to her bedroom. "Good night, Abigail," Preston replied, her name sounding different in his deep voice, like something valuable, something to be savored. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. It had been a long time since she'd felt this way, this awareness of a man, this flutter of anticipation when their eyes met. It was unexpected and slightly alarming. Preston Irwin was not the kind of man she had ever imagined herself, drawn to, rough-edged, unlettered, as different from her scholarly husband as a man could be. And yet, there was something about his quiet strength, his determination to learn, the gentleness he showed Emma that spoke to her in ways she couldn't ignore. Abigail slipped into bed beside her sleeping daughter, listening to the storm rage outside and wondering at the storm building within her own heart. The next morning, Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of low voices. Dressing quickly, she emerged from the bedroom to find Preston and Emma at the table, heads bent together over her book. "ONCEUPONATIME," Preston was sounding out slowly, his finger tracing the words as Emma nodded encouragingly. "That's right," Emma clapped her hands. "You're reading, Mr. Preston." Preston glanced up, catching Abigail's eye, a flash of embarrassment crossing his face before he schooled his expression. "Morning," he said gruffly. "Made coffee, hope that's all right." "More than all right," Abigail assured him, moving to pour herself a cup. "I see you've acquired another teacher." "Emma was helping me practice," Preston explained. "She's got patience, this one." "Like Mama," Emma said proudly. "She says a good teacher never gets cross when someone's trying their hardest." Preston's eyes met Abigail's over Emma's head. "Your Mama's right about that." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Preston rose to answer it, revealing Jim, his foreman, looking relieved. "Boss, thought you might have been caught in the flood. Miller's Creek overran its banks last night, washed out the lower bridge." "I'm fine," Preston assured him. "Mrs. Keller was kind enough to offer shelter from the storm." His tone was neutral, matter-of-fact, but Jim's quick glance between them made Abigail's cheeks warm. "Well, the men are waiting at the crossroads," Jim said. "We can still get to work through the North Road." Preston nodded. "I'll be along shortly." After Jim departed, he turned to Abigail. "Thank you for the hospitality." "You're welcome any time," she replied, then added hastily, "for lessons, of course." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "Of course." He knelt to Emma's level. "Thank you for the help this morning, Miss Emma. I'll practice what you showed me." Emma beamed. "We can read more tomorrow." Preston glanced at Abigail, a question in his eyes. "Emma has appointed herself your assistant teacher, it seems," Abigail explained. "If you don't mind." "Don't mind at all," Preston said, something like wonder in his voice. "Don't mind at all." Over the next few days, as the schoolhouse neared completion, a new pattern emerged. Preston would arrive early each morning, and before the other men showed up, Emma would sit with him at the table, helping him practice the previous night's lesson. Then, after a day of work and supper with his men at the ranch, he would return for his evening lesson with Abigail. The dynamic between them was shifting. Where once their interactions had been formal and guarded, now there was an ease, a comfortable familiarity that came from shared purpose. Preston's gruff exterior softened in Abigail's presence, and she found herself looking forward to their evenings together with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. 4 days before the school term was to begin, Preston and his men put the finishing touches on the schoolhouse, hanging the repaired bell in the tower, installing the last of the new glass in the windows, and setting up the rows of desks in neat lines. "It's magnificent," Abigail breathed, standing in the center of the room and turning slowly to take it all in. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the freshly painted walls and gleaming wooden floor. "I can't believe it's the same building." Preston stood in the doorway, watching her reaction with quiet satisfaction. His men had already headed back to the ranch, leaving them alone. "Needs books," he said, nodding toward the empty shelves, "and students." "The books arrive tomorrow on the supply wagon," Abigail told him. "And 17 students are enrolled so far." She walked to the teacher's desk, a new edition Preston had crafted himself, and ran her fingers along its smooth surface. "You've created something wonderful here, Preston." He shook his head, coming to stand beside her. "Just wood and nails." "You'll be the one to make it special." Abigail looked up at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. "We make a good team, don't we?" "We do at that," Preston agreed softly. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Abigail felt that same flutter in her chest, stronger now, impossible to ignore. Preston took a half-step closer, and she found herself leaning toward him almost involuntarily. "Mama, Mr. Preston, look what I found." Emma's voice broke the spell as she came running in from outside, clutching something in her hands. Preston stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "What have you got there, little miss?" Emma opened her hands to reveal a small blue jay feather. "It's the exact same blue as in my book's pictures. Can I keep it as a bookmark?" "I think that's a fine idea," Abigail said, her voice not quite steady. "Why don't you go put it in your book now?" "We'll be along in a moment." When Emma had skipped out, Abigail turned back to Preston, uncertain what to say. "I should go," he said, reaching for his hat. "Got ranch business to attend to." "Will you come for your lesson tonight?" Abigail asked, hating the hint of vulnerability in her question. Preston paused, then nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." That evening, the lesson had a different quality, attention, and awareness that hadn't been there before. They sat closer than usual, their shoulders occasionally brushing as Abigail guided Preston through a simple children's story. His progress was remarkable. While he still stumbled over longer words, he could now read basic sentences with growing confidence. "The brown dog jumped over the fence," he read slowly, his deep voice giving weight to the simple words. "He was happy to be free." "Excellent." Abigail praised, genuinely impressed. "You've come so far in such a short time." Preston closed the book, a complicated expression on his face. "Been thinking about what you said, about everyone deserving to read their own story." "Yes, never thought much about having a story before." His eyes met hers, direct and searching. "Always just did what needed doing. Building the ranch, making it through each season, planning for the next, didn't leave much room for other things." Abigail's heart quickened. "What sort of other things?" Preston's gaze dropped to her hands, then back to her face. "Family, companionship, the sorts of things most men want, I suppose. And now," Abigail hardly dared breathe, "now I'm not so sure the life I built is enough anymore." His voice had roughened, become more hesitant. "Meeting you and Emma, it's got me thinking there might be more chapters to my story than I figured." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Abigail felt a surge of emotion, hope, fear, longing all mingled together. "Preston," she began, not sure what she meant to say. Before she could continue, he reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I ain't good with words, Abigail, never have been, but I think I'm starting to feel something for you, something I wasn't expecting." Abigail's breath caught. "I feel it too," she admitted softly. Preston's eyes widened slightly, as though he hadn't dared hope for such a response. "Do you now?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's unexpected and perhaps unwise, but there it is." A smile, a real, full smile that transformed his face, broke across Preston's features. "Unwise, because I'm just a rancher who's only now learning his letters." "No," Abigail said quickly. "Because we hardly know each other. because I came here to build a new life, not to find a new." She trailed off, uncertain how to define what was growing between them. "A new what?" Preston prompted, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "A new beginning," she finished softly, Preston's smile gentled. "Maybe they're one and the same." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Abigail closed the distance between them, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek as their lips met in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief, almost chaste, but when they parted, Abigail felt as though something fundamental had shifted. The loneliness she'd carried since Daniel's death seemed less acute, as though a space within her heart that had been empty was beginning to fill again. "I should go," Preston said reluctantly, though he made no move to release her hand. "It's getting late." Abigail nodded, reality reasserting itself. "The school opens in 3 days. There's still much to prepare." Preston rose, drawing her to her feet alongside him. "I'll come tomorrow to help set up the books when they arrive." "Thank you," Abigail said, walking with him to the door. "For everything." At the threshold, Preston turned back to her. "Been meaning to ask what's that book of Emma's, the one she's so fond of." "It was a gift from her father," Abigail explained. "The Princess and the Dragon. It's about a clever princess who outsmarts a dragon threatening her kingdom. Daniel used to read it to her every night." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "Reckon I'd like to read the whole thing someday. See how it ends." "I think you're almost ready," Abigail told him, her heart full. "Just a few more lessons." His smile was tender as he bent to kiss her once more, briefly but with a promise of more to come. "I'll be here," he said. "Count on it." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The books arrived as promised, and Preston helped Abigail arrange them on the shelves, taking particular care with the small collection of primers that would help the youngest students begin their own journey into literacy. Word had spread about the handsome new schoolhouse, and several more families enrolled their children, bringing the total to 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Abigail prepared lesson plans, organized supplies, and tried not to let her nervousness show. Through it all, Preston was a steady presence. He fixed a leak that appeared during a light rain, built a small cabinet for Abigail's personal items, and even constructed a set of steps to make it easier for the smaller children to reach the water pump outside. Their evenings continued to be devoted to his reading lessons, though now they were punctuated with conversations about their pasts, their hopes, and occasionally with kisses that grew increasingly passionate. Preston spoke of his years building his ranch, of the challenges and satisfactions of creating something from nothing. Abigail shared stories of her teaching in Boston, of meeting Daniel at a literary society meeting, of the devastating news of his death at Gettysburg. Emma, observant as always, noticed the change between them. "Do you like Mr. Preston, Mama?" she asked one afternoon as they prepared the classroom for the first day of school. "Yes, dear, I do," Abigail answered honestly. "Very much." Emma nodded sagely. "I thought so. You look at him the way the princess in my book looks at the knight in the picture." Abigail smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. "And how do you feel about that?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I like it," she decided. "Mr. Preston makes you smile more. And he's learning to read my book." The day before school was to begin, Preston arrived at the schoolhouse with a surprise, a hand-carved sign to hang over the door, reading Willow Creek School in elegant lettering. "Jim helped with the words," he admitted as he and Abigail admired the installed sign. "But I did the carving." "It's beautiful," Abigail said sincerely. "The perfect finishing touch." That evening's lesson was special. Emma had asked to stay up to participate, and together, she and Abigail guided Preston through the first pages of The Princess and the Dragon. "Once upon a time," Preston began, his finger tracing the words he had come to know well, "there was a brave princess who lived in a tall tower. She loved to read books about faraway lands and great adventures." He continued slowly but steadily, occasionally asking for help with a difficult word. Emma beamed with pride at each page, and Abigail felt her heart swell with emotion as she watched them together, this unlikely pair bound by their shared love of a story. When they reached a natural stopping point, Abigail sent Emma to bed despite her protests that she wasn't tired. Once they were alone, Preston turned to Abigail with a serious expression. "Got something I want to ask you," he said, reaching for her hand. "Been thinking on it for days now." Abigail's pulse quickened. "Yes, tomorrow's a big day for you, first day of school and all." He hesitated, seeming to gather his courage. "Was wondering if you'd allow me to come calling. Properly, I mean. Sunday afternoons, maybe dinner sometimes at the ranch, court you like a gentleman should." Relief and joy flooded through Abigail. "I'd like that very much," she said, squeezing his hand. "It's soon, I know," Preston acknowledged. "We've only known each other a few weeks, but I feel like—" He searched for the words, "like I've been waiting for you without knowing it." "I understand," Abigail assured him. "I feel the same way." Preston's smile was tender as he leaned in to kiss her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. The kiss was deeper than their previous ones, filled with promise and growing passion. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Should go," he murmured. "Big day tomorrow." Abigail nodded reluctantly. "Will you come? To see the school open, wouldn't miss it," Preston promised. "Might even bring a little something for the teacher." The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the first day of school. Abigail rose early, donning her best dress and helping Emma into her new pinafore. They walked to the schoolhouse together, Emma chattering excitedly about meeting new friends. The transformation from the dilapidated building Abigail had first seen to the welcoming schoolhouse that now stood before them was remarkable. Fresh white paint gleamed in the morning sun, new glass windows sparkled, and Preston's sign hung proudly over the door. Inside, everything was in readiness: books on shelves, chalk and slates stacked neatly, desks arranged in tidy rows. Abigail felt a surge of gratitude and accomplishment as she surveyed the room. Students began arriving shortly before 9 o'clock, some eager, some apprehensive, all curious about their new teacher. Parents came too, introducing themselves and expressing their appreciation for the beautiful schoolhouse. At precisely 9, Abigail stepped onto the porch and rang the bell Preston had hung in the tower. Its clear tone echoed across the town, signaling the official opening of Willow Creek School. As the students filed in and took their seats, Abigail noticed Preston standing at the back of the room, hat in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Good morning, students," Abigail began, her voice steady and warm. "Welcome to Willow Creek School. I'm Mrs. Keller, and I'll be your teacher." The morning passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. The students were indeed different from the Boston children Abigail had taught, more restless, more practical in their questions, but also more self-reliant and eager to learn. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch, watching as they spilled out onto the schoolyard, unwrapping food brought from home and forming quick alliances and friendships. Preston approached as she stood in the doorway. "Seems to be going well," he observed, his eyes warm with pride. "It is," Abigail agreed. "They're wonderful children." "Got something for you," Preston said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small package wrapped in brown paper. A first-day gift. Curious, Abigail unwrapped it to find a beautifully carved wooden bookmark, decorated with intricate flowers and vines. "Preston, it's exquisite," she breathed, running her finger along the smooth wood. "Figured you'd be reading to them a lot," he explained. "Thought you might could use it." "I'll treasure it," Abigail said sincerely, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Thank you." Preston glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed, then leaned down to place a quick, soft kiss on her lips. "Proud of you," he murmured. "What you're doing here." Before Abigail could respond, the school bell rang again. Emma had taken it upon herself to signal the end of lunch, and children began streaming back toward the schoolhouse. "I should go," Preston said. "Let you get back to teaching." "Sunday," Abigail confirmed, "for dinner at the ranch." Preston's smile was radiant. I'll come for you and Emma at noon, looking forward to it already." As he walked away, Abigail touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. Then, squaring her shoulders, she turned back to her classroom, ready to begin the afternoon lessons. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. School days were full of teaching, while evenings often found Preston at Abigail's table, steadily improving his reading skills. Sunday afternoons were spent at the Double I Ranch, where Emma delighted in exploring the barns and corrals under Jim's watchful eye while Preston and Abigail enjoyed moments of privacy. Their courtship progressed steadily, their feelings deepening with each conversation, each shared experience. Preston proved to be a thoughtful suitor, bringing small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the prairie, a handkerchief embroidered by one of the ranch wives, once even a box of chocolate drops ordered specially from Denver. 2 months after the school opened, on a crisp October evening, Preston and Abigail sat on the schoolhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink. Emma was inside, practicing her penmanship at her mother's desk. "Got something to show you," Preston said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Been working on it for a while now, curious." Abigail took the paper and unfolded it. It was a letter, written in Preston's now recognizable handwriting. The letters were carefully formed, the sentences simple but clear. "Dear Abigail," she read aloud softly, "I am writing this letter to tell you what is in my heart. When I first met you, I was a man who could not read. Now I can read and write, but more important, I can love again. You and Emma have brought joy to my life. I never thought I would have a family, but now I hope that we might make one together. Will you marry me? With love, Preston." Tears blurred Abigail's vision as she looked up to find Preston watching her intently, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and hope. "Preston," she whispered, her voice catching. "Meant every word," he said quietly. "I love you, Abigail, you and Emma both. Want to build a life with you if you'll have me." In answer, Abigail leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her feelings into the embrace. "Yes," she said when they parted. "Yes, I'll marry you." Preston's face lit with joy. He reached into his other pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "Got this in Denver last week," he explained, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but brilliant diamond. "Wanted to do this proper." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Abigail felt a sense of completion, of coming home after a long journey. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily, naturally. "Love you too," Preston replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I have words for yet." They were married on Christmas Eve in the schoolhouse, which had been transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and red ribbon. The entire town turned out for the celebration, filling the room with warmth and goodwill. Emma served as flower girl, scattering pine needles in lieu of petals down the makeshift aisle between the desks. Jim stood as Preston's best man, while Thomas Wilson, who had become a friend to Abigail, gave her away. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. As they exchanged vows, Abigail looked into Preston's eyes and saw their future reflected there, a life built on mutual respect and deepening love. A family bound by choice as well as circumstance. At the reception that followed, Preston surprised everyone by standing to make a speech. Public speaking had never been his forte, but he had written his words carefully and practiced reading them until he was confident. "When I met Abigail," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room, "I was a man who thought he had everything he needed. I had my land, my cattle, a roof over my head, but I couldn't read a word on a page." He smiled at Emma, who beamed back at him from her place beside her mother. "A little girl and her book showed me what I was missing. And her mother showed me that it's never too late to learn something new, whether it's reading or loving again." He turned to Abigail, his expression tender. "Thank you for teaching me how to read my story, our story. It's the best one I've ever heard." As applause filled the room, Preston bent to kiss his bride, sealing their promises with a touch that spoke of both passion and permanence. Later that night, After the celebration had ended and Emma had been tucked into bed in her new room at the ranch house, Preston led Abigail to the porch. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Abigail assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Though I was thinking about how different my life is now from what I expected when I first arrived," Preston chuckled. "Coming west for a schoolhouse, leaving with a husband and a ranch. The best kind of surprise," Abigail said, turning in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret it?" "Learning to read, it's changed everything for you." "Only regret is not learning sooner," Preston replied honestly. "But then, maybe it wouldn't have meant as much without you to teach me." Abigail smiled, remembering those first tentative lessons, the way his large hands had fumbled with chalk and pencil, the concentration in his eyes as he'd sounded out simple words. "You've come so far." "Got further to go yet," Preston acknowledged. "Still stumble over the big words." "But I'll get there." His eyes held hers, sincere and loving. "Got a lifetime now to keep learning with you." As they sealed this promise with a kiss, Abigail knew that their story, like all the best ones, wasn't ending with happily ever after, but rather beginning a new chapter, one they would write together, word by carefully learned word. 5 years later, Abigail stood in the doorway of their ranch house, watching as Preston sat on the porch swing with Emma and their 3-year-old son, James, nestled against him. Open on his lap was The Princess and the Dragon, its pages worn from countless readings. And so the princess, having outsmarted the dragon and saved her kingdom, discovered that true courage comes not from fighting battles but from following your heart, Preston read fluently, his deep voice giving weight to the familiar words. "The end." "Again, Papa." James demanded, his small face eager. Preston laughed, ruffling the boy's dark hair so like his own. "Not tonight, son, it's nearly bedtime." Emma, now 11 and as bookish as ever, closed the book carefully. "Besides, there are other stories to read. I borrowed a new one from school yesterday." "Is that so?" Preston raised an eyebrow. "And what's this one about?" "Cowboys," Emma said with a grin. "Very brave ones who save school teachers from leaky roofs and teach little boys to ride horses." Preston's eyes met Abigail's over the children's heads, filled with the love and understanding that had grown between them with each passing year. "Sounds like a good story," he said softly. "The very best kind." And as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Abigail knew that some stories, the most important ones, were written not on pages, but in the hearts of those who lived them, word by precious word.